Chapter 10. Paul. Paul had the best seat in Mrs. Jewell's class. He sat in the back of the room. It was the seat that was farthest away from Mrs. Jewell's. Mrs. Jewell was teaching the class about fractions. She drew a picture of a pie on the blackboard. She cut the pie into 8 pieces. She explained that each piece was 1/8 of the pie. Paul never paid attention. He didn't see the picture of the pie. He didn't see anything. Well, he did see one thing. Actually, he saw 2 things. He saw Leslie's 2 pigtails. Leslie sat in front of Paul. She had 2 long brown pigtails that reached all the way down to her waist. Paul saw those pigtails and a terrible urge came over him. He wanted to pull a pigtail. He wanted to wrap his fist around it, feel the hair between his fingers, and just yank. He thought it would also be fun to tie the pigtails together, or better yet, tie them to her chair. But most of all, he just wanted to pull one. Slowly he reached for the one on the right. No! What am I doing? He thought. I'll only get into trouble. Paul had it made. He sat in the back of the room. He paid no attention to anyone, and nobody paid any attention to him. But if he pulled a pigtail, it would all be over. Leslie would tell on him, and he'd become the center of attention. He sighed and slowly withdrew his arm. But Paul couldn't ignore those pigtails. There they were, dangling right in front of him, just begging to be pulled. He could close his eyes, but he couldn't make the pigtails disappear. He could still smell them and hear them. He could almost taste them. Maybe just a little tug, he thought. No, none. Then they hung easily within his reach. Well, let them just hang there, thought Paul. It would be foolish to pull one, no matter how tempting they were. None of the other children in class pulled pigtails. Why should he? Of course, none of the other children sat behind Leslie either. It was just a simple matter of being able to think clearly. That was all. Paul thought it over and decided not to pull one. It was as simple as that. Suddenly his arm shot forward. He grabbed Leslie's right pigtail and yanked. Yeah! Screamed Leslie. Everybody looked at her. Paul pulled my pigtail, she said. They all looked at Paul. I couldn't help it, said Paul. You'd better learn to help it, said Mrs. Jewell. She wrote Paul's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Tell Leslie you're sorry. I'm sorry, Leslie, said Paul. Said Leslie. Paul felt horrible. Never again would he pull another pigtail. Except there was one problem. He still wasn't satisfied. He had pulled the right one, but that wasn't enough. He wanted to pull the left one too. It was as if he heard a little voice coming from the pigtail saying, Pull me, Paul. I can't, Paul answered. My name's already on the board under the word discipline. Big deal, said the pigtail. Pull me. No way, said Paul. Never again. Come on, Paul. Just a little tug, urged the pigtail. What harm could it do? Lots of harm, said Paul. Leslie will scream, and I'll get in trouble again. Boy, that's not fair, whined the pigtail. You pulled the right one. Now it's my turn. I know, but I can't, said Paul. Sure you can, said the pigtail. Just grab me and yank. No, said Paul. It's not right. Sure it is, Paul, said the pigtail. Pigtails are meant to be pulled. That's what we're here for. Tell that to Leslie, said Paul. Leslie won't mind, said the pigtail. I promise. I bet, said Paul, just like she didn't mind the last time. You just didn't pull hard enough, said the pigtail. Leslie likes us pulled real hard. Really? Asked Paul. Cross my heart, said the pigtail. The harder, the better. Okay, said Paul, but if you're lying, I promise, said the pigtail. Paul grabbed the left pigtail. It felt good in his hand. He pulled it as hard as he could. Yeah! Screamed Leslie. Mrs. Jewell asked, Paul, did you pull Leslie's pigtail again? No, said Paul. I pulled the other one. All the children laughed. Are you trying to be funny? Asked Mrs. Jewls. No, said Paul. I was trying to be fair. I couldn't pull one and not the other. The children laughed again. Pigtails are meant to be pulled, Paul concluded. Mrs. Jewls put a check next to Paul's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. But at last Paul was satisfied. True, his name was on the blackboard with a check next to it, but that really didn't matter. All he had to do was stay out of trouble the rest of the day, and his name would be erased. It's easy to stay out of trouble when you have the best seat in the class. In fact, Paul could do this every day. He could pull Leslie's pigtails twice and then stay out of trouble the rest of the day. There was nothing Leslie could do about it. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Leslie screamed, "Yeah!" Mrs. Jewls circled Paul's name and sent him home early on the kindergarten bus. Nobody would believe that he hadn't pulled Leslie's pigtail again. Chapter 11. Dana. Dana had 4 beautiful eyes. She wore glasses. But her eyes were so beautiful that the glasses only made her prettier. With 2 eyes, she was pretty. With 4 eyes, she was beautiful. With 6 eyes, she would have been even more beautiful, and if she had 100 eyes all over her face and her arms and her feet, why, she would have been the most beautiful creature in the world. But poor Dana wasn't covered from head to foot with beautiful flies. She was covered with mosquito bites. Mrs. Jewls picked up her yardstick and said, "Now, it's time for arithmetic." "Oh, no, Mrs. Jewls," said Dana. "I can't do arithmetic. I itch all over. I can't concentrate." "But we have all kinds of arithmetic," said Mrs. Jewls. "Addition without carrying, addition with carrying, and carrying without addition." "I don't care," cried Dana. "We have that too," said Mrs. Jewls. "Addition without carrying. Now stop carrying on." Dana whined, "I can't, Mrs. Jewls. I itch too much." "And I'm thirsty," said DJ. "I'm too tired," said Ron. "I'm too hungry," said Terrence. "I'm too stupid," said Todd. Mrs. Jewls hit her desk with her yardstick. Everyone stopped talking. Mrs. Jewls said, "We are going to have arithmetic now, and I don't want to hear another thing about it." "But Mrs. Jewls, I really do itch. I can't do arithmetic," Dana whined. "No," said Mrs. Jewls. "Arithmetic is the best known cure for an itch." "How many mosquito bites do you have?" "I don't know," said Dana. "Over 100. First I try scratching one, but then another one starts to itch. So I scratch that one, and then that one stops, and another one starts to itch. So I scratch that one, and then the itch moves down to another one. Then it goes back to the first one. The itch just never stays in the same place. I just can't scratch them all." "What you need is a good, strong dose of arithmetic," said Mrs. Jewls. "I'd rather have calamine lotion," said Dana. "Remember, Dana," said Mrs. Jewls, "mosquito bites itch, not numbers." "So what?" said Dana. Mrs. Jewls continued, "We'll just have to turn your mosquito bites into numbers." "I'm a mess," Dana moaned. Mrs. Jewls began to turn the mosquito bites into numbers. "How much is 3 mosquito bites plus 3 mosquito bites?" she asked. Rondi raised her hand. 6 mosquito bites, she answered. "How much is 6 mosquito bites minus 2 mosquito bites?" asked Mrs. Jewls. 4 mosquito bites, said DJ. "How much is 5 mosquito bites times 2? asked Mrs. Jewls. 10 mosquito bites, said BB. "Very good," said Mrs. Jewls. "I still itch," Dana complained. "I've got one more question," said Mrs. Jewls. "How much is 49 mosquito bites plus 75 mosquito bites?" Nobody raised a hand. "Think, class," said Mrs. Jewls. "This is for Dana." Nobody knew the answer. Dana's itch began to get worse and worse. At last, Dana began counting her own mosquito bites. She counted 75 of them on one side and 49 on the other. Then she added together for a total of 124 mosquito bites. 124 mosquito bites, Dana called. "Very good," said Mrs. Jewls. Dana had 124 mosquito bites, and none of them itched anymore. "I'm still thirsty," said DJ. "Can arithmetic do anything for that?" I'm still tired, said Ron. I'm still hungry, said Terrence. I'm still stupid, said Todd. I'm glad we turned my mosquito bites into numbers instead of letters, said Dana. I could never spell the word mosquito. Chapter 12. Jason. Jason had a small face and a big mouth. He had the second biggest mouth in Mrs. Jewls' class, and there were an awful lot of big mouths in that class. Mrs. Jewls, Jason called without raising his hand, Joy is chewing gum in class. Joy had the biggest mouth in class, and it was filled with gum. There was hardly even room for her tongue. Joy, I'm ashamed of you, said Mrs. Jewls. I'm afraid I'm going to have to put your name up on the board. That's okay, Mrs. Jewls, Jason called. I'll do it. Jason hopped out of his seat and wrote Joy's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. While he was up, Joy took the glob of gum out of her mouth and placed it on Jason's chair. Rondi and Allison giggled. Jason walked back from the blackboard to his desk and sat down. Mrs. Jewls, he called, I'm stuck. Rondi and Allison giggled again. Mrs. Jewls got angry. Joy, you're going home on the kindergarten bus today. Oh, good, said Todd. I'll have some company. Todd went home on the kindergarten bus every day. He could never seem to make it to 12 o'clock without getting into trouble 3 times. His name wasn't even up on the blackboard yet, but he knew that by 12 o'clock it would be up, checked and circled. Mrs. Jewls, what am I going to do? I'm stuck. I'm going to have to stay here the rest of my life, said Jason. Joy, tell Jason you're sorry, said Mrs. Jewls. I'm sorry, Jason, said Joy. Oh, that's okay, Joy, said Jason. I don't mind. Try to get up, Jason, said Mrs. Jewls. Jason tried. I can't, Mrs. Jewls. I'm stuck. Mrs. Jewls asked the 3 Erics to help. Eric Fry and Eric Ovens pulled Jason. Eric Bacon held the chair. Stop, cried Jason. You'll rip my pants. Rondi and Allison giggled. All right, said Mrs. Jewls. Let's try ice water. That should freeze the gum and make it less sticky. I'll go get some from Miss Mush. Miss Mush was the lunch teacher at Wayside School. She had the remarkable ability to undercook a dish and overcook it at the same time. Her specialty was a nice hot bowl of mud. She called it porridge. Jason looked at Rondi and Allison. No, Mrs. Jewls, he said. Don't leave me. Besides, Miss Mush ice water is probably warm. Don't be silly, Jason, said Mrs. Jewls. I'm sure it will at least be as cold as her soups. Rondi and Allison leered at Jason. No, Mrs. Jewls, don't go, begged Jason. I'll be right back, Jason, said Mrs. Jewls. She went to Miss Mush for some ice water. As soon as Mrs. Jewls stepped out the door, Rondi and Allison jumped up from their seats and started to tickle Jason. He laughed until his hair turned purple. The girls got back to their seats just in time for Mrs. Jewls to return. Mrs. Jewls carried a big bucket of ice-cold water. Oh, no, please don't, no, Jason pleaded. We have no choice, said Mrs. Jewls. She threw the water all over him. Well, said Mrs. Jewls, try to get up. Jason was drenched. I'm wet and I'm cold and I'm still stuck. Oh, well, it didn't work, said Mrs. Jewls. At least we tried. Now I guess we'll have to cut your pants off. Rondi and Allison giggled. No, Mrs. Jewls, no, Jason screamed. I don't mind being stuck here. I'm really very comfortable. Don't be silly, Jason, said Mrs. Jewls. Don't cut off my pants, said Jason. The 3 Erics can carry you to the bathroom, said Mrs. Jewls. I'll ask Louis to call your mother. She can bring you a new pair of pants. The 3 Erics took a hold of Jason's chair and turned him upside down. No, Mrs. Jewls, said Jason. Now I'll always have a place to sit down. I won't have to worry about finding a seat on the bus. The 3 Erics began to take him away. Wait, said Joy. Mrs. Jewls, if I can get Jason unstuck, do I have to go home on the kindergarten bus? All right, said Mrs. Jewls. If you can somehow get Jason free, you don't have to go home early. Don't trust her, Mrs. Jules, said Jason. He was still hanging upside down. I'll just kiss him, said Joy. No, Jason screamed. Don't let her kiss me. Mrs. Jules, throw water on me, tickle me, cut off my pants, hang me upside down from the ceiling, but don't let her kiss me. I'll just kiss him on the nose, said Joy. We've got nothing to lose, Jason, said Mrs. Jules. Ooh, who would want to kiss Jason, said Allison. Jason hung helplessly upside down. Joy stepped up and kissed him on the nose. Jason fell out of the chair and hit his head on the floor. Rondi and Allison giggled. Darn, said Todd. Now I'll have to go home alone again. Joy erased her name from the blackboard.